Okay, here's 2 tips for you. First tip, when you are filling pinholes, don't do what I did. Don't do things like this. Fill the little pinhole individually, even if there's like here I have 3 or 4 clustered together, and I just took kind of a broad swath and kind of wiped on them, lathered on some filler. That's just creating way more work than it needs to be. You just need to fill the pinholes specifically. You just saw me laboring on the fender here. There were only like 4 little holes there, and I had to sand that thing for probably 10 minutes to get down to where I needed to be. So that's tip number 1. And tip number 2, not related to cars at all, but hey, wear sunscreen when you're spring skiing. I got cooked. My face is on fire. But a small price to pay, a beautiful day. So I'm gonna continue sanding here, learning lessons as I go. I'll try to share these little tidbits of wisdom as I stumble on them. Hey, one thing that's nice kind of to note, sanding in my spray booth is great. I get this really strong flow from right to left, and keeps the dust nice and clear. Clears the dust out nicely. So that's kind of a nice bonus. Wasn't seeing that one coming. So stick with me. More sanding. I have to say that this is a very satisfying part of the job. Block sanding this first, doing your first round of block sanding, the primer really sands nicely. It's the nicest stuff I've ever sanded. It comes off really clean. The sandpaper stays clean, and it's satisfying knowing that as I'm doing this, any of these small low spots that I'm seeing show up disappear really after a couple, 3, 4, 5 strokes of the sander. So I know that everything is really flat, which leads me to believe that my body work so far has been at least okay, I guess. I haven't really spotted any problems yet. But in general, I'm just kind of going back and forth across the seams like this, well, across the whole body for that matter, until I see a completely unified scratch with no low spots. And of course doing it in a X pattern. But no, this is actually a lot of fun. I wouldn't have thought sanding would have been fun.
So after we finished blocking with 320, we then moved on to smaller pads at 400 dry. 400 is the first point where we actually started to address any of the edges, hood and trunk openings, door edges, things of that nature. I felt like going at that with any more aggressive sandpaper probably would have just simply worn through the primer. So here we are going at that with 400, and you can see we're using smaller pads. From here, the next step is to go to 400 wet. You'll also notice that in between each stage, we're wiping the car down with Windex, just making sure we're getting rid of all of the previous grit, which there's surprisingly quite a bit gets left over. I didn't want it to blow. I didn't want to blow the car off and kind of commit that to the air and the surrounding area. So wiping it down with Windex seems to be the right way to do it.
Well, here we are after an entire day of sanding. I'd like to give a big shout out and a huge thank you to my buddy Nate. He very nicely donated an entire day of his labor and spent it pushing some sandpaper around. So I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. So, like I said, it was an entire day of sanding, and we started with, I think this morning I had, when we started the day, the car was block sanded to 220. So I had, the entire car was 220. And then from there we block sanded to 320. And after the block sanding, we went to 400 sand, again block, but we're going to smaller blocks at this point. It's more of a sanding approach. Obviously we're not doing any shaping at this point. So at this point it was just really to make sure we get rid of all the pre-existing sand marks from the earlier grits. And then we went to 400 grit wet, and then did the entire car 400 grit wet. And I mean, it's as smooth as I can imagine ever needing to be, but I guess the general rule of thumb is you bring it to 600 if you're doing a metallic paint, and I am. So 600 is the next step, 600 wet, I should say. But I got to tell you, it was a long day, but it was super satisfying. It's a lot of fun, actually, kind of sanding this and seeing the fruits of your labor from a body work standpoint. I did spend a lot of time on the body work, and I was cautious and nervous at that, knowing that any small mistake there would really be biting me at this point. So it paid off. I'm happy with it. We really didn't find any big errors. A couple little spots needed to be filled, and I'll show you those. But I'll do a quick walk around the car. But you know, the only snafu I had today was a little bit of a tongue lashing from my wife for stealing all of her spray bottles. We'll work that out later. I think we're still good, I hope. Okay, so this is where the car sits, and again, so this is at a 400 grit wet sand, and a few sand spot or through spots where we went down to the red, which is no biggie because this is going to get a sealer coat, which I believe is just a thin coat of primer, right before I paint it, right before I put color down. So a few sand through spots, not a big deal. But it is smooth. I mean, there's just no texture to it. And the stuff is fun to sand. It really sands nicely. I mean, I guess I'm used to sanding stuff in the furniture biz where sandpaper clogs up. It doesn't really do that with this stuff. So fun and pleasant surprise. So yeah, so this is where I'm at now. Next step is gonna, I guess, bring this to a 600 grit wet sand. The wet sanding goes really quickly. It's kind of a treat again. And there are the hood and trunk and doors. So yeah, next step is the 600, and then I think I'm going to be painting this in a couple of days. After kind of a thorough washing in here, I'll wet the floors down. But yeah, there we go. What just a great day of sanding, I think. To give you an idea, after primer, I think all said and done, there's probably about 12 to 15 hours of sanding on this to just to kind of get, well, I guess there would be more because that second day had two people. So hey, sorry for the long diatribe there, but I thought you guys that are jumping into this might find it interesting to know how much time it took. So I guess from an hour standpoint, about 20 hours sanding on this. I guess that sounds like a lot now that I'm thinking about it. Well, okay, on to the next step. So I got 5 words to say. I just painted a freaking car. I can't believe it. It worked. It actually worked. And I'm kind of over the moon in terms of the results. I'm actually beyond surprised. So I think before I kind of walk you through actually what the car looks like, I wanted to do a real quick recap. This is, I guess, something I would have liked to have seen kind of going into this. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about my approach and how I got to this point. So first, you saw the body work, lots of sanding, a lot of attention paid to those, any of the mold seams. And so I basically got the whole car to the point where I was pretty confident in its flatness, and that was done by blocking. I blocked down to, I think, 220 before I did any type of priming work. So blocked to 220, and then I DA'd the whole car down at 320, and very light on the touch, and that I stayed mainly the flat panels, then kind of went at the other parts with a hand approach with varying degrees of kind of softer blocks, I guess. So at that point I was ready for primer, and so I did several coats of, I did, let's see, 1, 2, 3, I did three coats of Nason primer. So first off, I did a Nason product, soup to nuts. So Nason primer, sandable primer, Nason sealer, Nason base coat, and Nason top coat. And the reason I chose Nason is I found a local paint shop that was actually able to kind of spend some time with me. And real quickly, I'm going to touch on that. Find a good paint shop locally. I don't know if unless you've got a lot more experience than I did, don't rely on buying stuff off the interwebs, because I needed to have some real conversation on painting beyond what I've seen on YouTube, but beyond every automotive paint book that I've read. I just wanted to have some conversations, some real world conversations, and I went through 3 different paint shops before I actually found somebody that I felt like they knew what they're doing, B, had a little bit of familiarity with my situation, garage shop kind of painting, and then third, somebody who's actually willing to spend some time with me, knowing that I'm going to be, buying all this paint and likely all the kind of supplies surrounding that. So I did. I found a paint shop, spent some time there. The guy was great, and got all my products. So anyways, back to the process. I got my I think it was 3 coats, maybe 4 coats of primer, sandable primer, and I let that sit for 5 days, 4 or 5 days. And then I went at that, the very first thing I did was I went back to a 320 block, and I blocked the whole car at 320, sanded the radiuses, kind of did exactly what I did to prep for the body prior to the primer. I did it all over again with the primer, except this time I went down to, I think my next step was, so 320, I went to 400, and then 400 wet. And I'd like to do a quick shout out to my buddy Nate. Thanks, Nate. He spent an entire day here helping me sand. Claims he liked it. I don't know if he's just being a good guy or not, but in any event, talk about shaving a day off of labor in that kind of area is a really great thing. So thank you. So I got everything down to 400 wet. I actually almost stopped there because I couldn't imagine the surface being any smoother. But I'm painting metallic finish, so I was overly sensitive there. I think they always say bring at least a 600. So I ended up doing a 600 wet after that 400 wet. I didn't notice any difference in the outcome between the 400 and 600 wet. But in any event, I did. I went to 600 wet. I then wiped the whole car down with Windex, let that dry, and then went back at it with a prep, like a prep-all kind of material, and I think it smells just like naphtha. Wiped the whole thing down with that, and I think we've talked about this, or I've showed you this leading up to this point. So did all that, and then after that was good and dry, I sprayed my sealer coat. And this is a coat that you don't sand, and it goes on pretty thin. You got to be
got to be cautious because it's the thinnest, it's much thinner than the primer in terms of the way it sprays, so got to be aware of making sure you don't create drips or sags. And I was good and lucky, I would probably say, is more likely how that happened. Nice and clean. And then 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later, I'm on to the base coat. Base coat was a little trippy because that's, you know, now it's real. It's just not something I'm going to sand on, right? So there's really not a lot of room for error here. And I practiced on a couple of panels, spent a lot of time getting my gun set up. I'm using a Harbor Freight purple gun, same gun that everybody seems to use in my situation. It worked flawlessly. I have a 21-gallon compressor. I can't see how much horsepower. It's not a good one. This is a $300 special from Harbor Freight. It worked great. I have some filters in line to remove oil and debris and moisture. It didn't stress at all, hardly. So I wouldn't have needed anything bigger. Maybe it's because it's a smaller car. So I got through the 3 coats of base. They covered really nice. After the second coat, I probably could have stopped there, but this car has so many curves and shapes, and I was so nervous about maybe not seeing something up underneath or some angle I was missing, so I went back at it again for a third coat. After the third coat started to set up, I got a little discouraged, I'll be honest with you, because I saw some kind of waves, not physical undulations, but waves in the color. But it turns out it wasn't waves in the color, it was the metallic flake not laying flatly. And then I remembered what the guy at the paint shop said, and then what I read about, anytime you're spraying metallic, you need to do a orientation spray or an orientation cover, the very last spray, and you basically hold the gun about 18 inches off, and you more or less mist the entire car. And that made all the difference in the world. All of a sudden, all the panels looked even, everything had an even sheen, even color, all the metallic flake looked similar. So that was key right there. And then 15 minutes I'm on, 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later, I'm on to doing the clear coat. Clear coat, I was really stressed about, honestly, went pretty easy. I did 3 coats of clear. You know, the flash time on the clear is really quick. It's 7 to 10 minutes, I think. And that's about the time it takes to kind of, mix up a new batch of clear and kind of get your situation organized. And every time in between I sprayed, I'd wipe down the hose that was in the garage, in the booth itself. I was nervous about bringing stuff in, dragging the hose along the floor, and I'm kind of glad I did that. And then got the 3 coats of clear on, and that's kind of where I'm at now. So I'm going to show you what it looks like. I did expect some orange peel, and I got it, but not bad. And my next step is to give this a day or two, maybe longer. I sprayed up a couple of test panels, and I'm gonna wait till those cure a little bit, practice cutting and buffing on those to see if the finish is ready to do it. I know that varies pretty wildly with temperature. I'm able to get my spray booth up to about 75 degrees, and I think that's been kind of a saving grace. So with all of that long diatribe done, I apologize about that, but I know that I kind of would have liked to have heard this going into it. So let's take a walk through what I've done, and I'll kind of maybe hit on a few of the points as I see them in front of me. Okay, so let's start with the rims. You saw me painting these. The color's a little deceiving here. It's actually a gunmetal, and the lighting in here does something weird to it, but as soon as you get outside, it does lighten up quite a bit. But it's a really nice color. I'm really happy about it. That's actually the accent color on this car throughout. But so real quickly, what I did to get the rims to this point is I sandblasted them, and first of all, I did it with the rubber on. Logistically, that was the only way I was going to be able to do this. But I sandblasted with what was that media? Glass bead media. And it was just enough to kind of put a texture on that very thick
clear or very thick gloss that was on these, and it was great. You know, it didn't take much to get all this down to a surface that paint was going to stick to nicely, and it did. It actually worked out great. So same exact process I just talked about with the car, except I did not do a primer because I didn't need to do a primer. They were completely covered in a finish that was very well adhered to the rim. I never got down to raw aluminum on this, so I was confident in this paint sticking to the rims. So let's move on. Let's get to the other part here. So I guess this is my big reveal on the color. I guess here we go. So here's the car, and I'm not so sure this color is coming out correctly in this kind of strong LED lighting. This color is called Tobacco Brown. It's a Porsche color from the 70s, and I've always liked this color, but I gotta hand it to my wife. She chose it, and she's the one that said, you know what, this car needs to be brown. I love brown, and you know what, she was spot on, because I could not be happier about the way this came out. So here's the hood, and you know, again, the coverage was great on this. Logistically, this was the biggest part of painting, obviously, and I think most of you that have done this and know this, and those that haven't might be suspecting it, but you know, the hard part is you got to figure out a way to spray all this stuff without getting the overspray on the adjacent parts, and there's certain orders you got to work in, knowing how the air flows through your booth, and my booth worked pretty well, so I was pretty good about controlling that, and it paid dividends, because I really didn't get much overspray on anything, and I'm trying to get a kind of a side shot of the reflection, but you can see it laid pretty flat. I mean, it doesn't look too far off of what a OEM finish would be, at least on the doors. I've got some other areas I need to address, but so hey, you know, happy with those, and again, you know, it just worked. I'm in a complete state of shock that the paint went on it and stuck. I didn't have anything fall on it while I was painting it. I didn't brush it with a hose. I didn't do anything like that. And I think some dumb luck played a big role in that. But I did practice. I'll say that I practiced walking around here probably a half dozen times with the hose to see what it would do as I dragged it around the car, and to see if it would have a tendency to flip up, and made some adjustments. I did notice that the coil, the hose did have a coil into it, and it did want to pop up a few points. So again, really sorry for the long segment here, but I thought you guys would kind of want to see this. There seems to be a lot of questions surrounding this. So basically what I did is I took this week off, and so what you're seeing basically represents about 7 days of work, and that's starting with the body being ready for primer. So exactly 7 days ago, I was setting up this tent and getting ready to spray primer. I think I sprayed primer 6 days ago, 7 days ago, 6 days ago. So 6 straight days of work, 10-hour days kind of thing. Obviously sanding, getting this down to a 600 grit took probably 20 hours of sanding. Maybe more, actually, considering I had my buddy help me, so probably more. So I guess go into it expecting that much. But you know, I got a drip here and maybe a sag, another spot in the clear that I got to work on, but those are easy fixes. So I am one happy guy here, and this is just a huge milestone in this build. The single most stressful part of this build, hands down, not even a close second, was painting the car, and because it's a do or die kind of thing, right? It's also something that everything has to line up to make work. It's not, I know I've mentioned this before, but you can't start and stop and start and stop as time permits. You just need to basically set aside this big chunk of time to make this all work, and it did.
So now it's on to the really fun part. You know, I'm gonna get everything cleaned up. I'm gonna, like I said, wait a few days before I try to cut and buff, based on how the finishes cure off. And then I'm on to assembling parts. You know, I'm going to do sound deadening, carpet, interior panels, things like that. So that's the next stuff you'll see. So again, very sorry for this long segment here, but thanks for watching, and on to the next good stuff.